We have already seen in Canada, we've seen it in Australia, we've seen it in the United Kingdom, activists will weaponize the police against dissenting women. You've had the police at your door. She was actually astonished by how quickly she was pushed through this affirmative process to have irreparable changes done to her body. And she trusted these professionals. My research on this topic has been available for a while now. You can see my first report called Mission Creeps, which was released a few months ago. And then most recently, as John mentioned at the start, Indoctrinating Children, How Brussels Embeds Gender Identity in the Classroom. So you mentioned that you imagine this is happening everywhere, Kelly, and it is indeed. And I document some of the ways in which NGO funding has sort of followed the money and what does this actually look like on the ground. So I invite you to have a look at that. But today I want to highlight some of the findings of my ongoing research through looking at some particularly worrying aspects of the LGBTIQ Equality Strategy, which was the 2026-2030 version, which was recently released. And in particular, I want to highlight a few things that you should be aware of in order to understand what's really going on here and what some of the consequences are. So first, how the strategy uses a series of rhetorical shields, and I think human shields, really. The way, and it's not just how the strategy works, but generally, because it is a product of NGO activism, how this issue kind of functions rhetorically is to use women and gays and lesbians, and often intersex people, as a kind of shield that says, oh, well, you know, we're really talking about sexual orientation. Most people don't have a problem with that. Actually, we're talking about gender, and most people think, oh, is that women? So I'll talk about that. And second, the gradual displacement of sex by gender as an innate identity, and the confusion and the problems that this creates. And finally, moves to police dissent, things like the expansion of hate speech legislation under the guise of harmonizing legislation across Europe. Okay, so on the first point, the EU doesn't have competence in a lot of the areas that are nonetheless enormously affected by gender identity ideology. As I explained in my most recent report, it will use funding mechanisms via non-discrimination pathways in order to fund NGOs to develop, for instance, teacher training or curricula that essentially affects education systems in potentially very, very powerful ways, but launders these so it'll create like a pilot project or turnkey curriculum materials. And then we'll launder these as best practice for teacher training to use across Europe. And there's a lot of these programs have many, many different countries involved, particularly Eastern European countries. And they will embed that gender identity ideology into curriculum materials from the very, very earliest ages through the entire education system. And in countries that have explicitly attempted to stop this, to ban LGBTIQ teaching for minors, they use mechanisms to get around this. Very specifically, the EU has funded NGOs to get around that and nonetheless get this into the education system. So it's very clear, murky territory in terms of legality, but there's a very clear attempt to evade what are the express desires of the democratically elected governments of member states in order to get gender identity ideology into classrooms. So that's one way is this, because the EU is such a sprawling institution, it's actually not that difficult. When people say, oh, well, the EU doesn't have competency in this particular area, that's not going to happen. Well, I'm a sociologist. I recognize that, and been teaching social policy at universities for almost 20 years. And society is extraordinarily complex. Policy is extraordinarily complex. Health policy will naturally involve all sorts of different economic, social, and so on elements. So it's actually not that difficult to get a particular kind of agenda into member states by using these different mechanisms. So obviously, freedom of movement is one. So you can use strategic litigation in order to pick particular cases in order to force changes at the national level. And therefore exert a profound effect, for instance, on family policy. You can talk, as I mentioned at the start, protection against discrimination and so on. So there are all these different kinds of mechanisms that can be used to essentially evade subsidiarity. And a broader question, which I don't really have time to talk about, is kind of why? Why is this? why is there such a powerful desire to evade subsidiarity and get into family policy and get into education, get into these areas and exert an influence, an ideological influence to change the values of citizens? And I think part of it is that there is a very profound belief at the heart of a lot of these movements that essentially the people, if like, Europe would be a great place if it weren't for the people. Like, if we could, like, people are too traditional. They're sort of mired by religion and the past and so on. If we could sort of intervene and change people's values, then they would make better choices, and this would lead to a better, for instance, economy. So if you could disrupt, for instance, gender stereotyping at an early age, then you get more women in the workplace. And that is more or less explicitly stated in some of the educational materials that I looked at. So you can sort of go in and disrupt so-called stereotypical behaviors in early years education, then somehow, some way down the line, you will encourage those women to go into the workplace. And this is supposed to, feed economic growth by getting more and more women into these often poorly paid jobs. And it's quite a complex point that I don't have time to go into, but if you are interested in that, you can look at my report, Families in Fragments, which is one of the first reports that I produced for MCC Brussels. So that's kind of how you have this sort of evasion of subsidiarity, but also one of the ways in which this discourse kind of proceeds is through a rhetorical cover. So women, for instance, are used often as a cover for gender identity ideology. So if you are critical of this idea that gender is this core essence, that a child can choose whether or not they are a boy or a girl or in between or whatever. If you are against what people often call gender woo, this idea that there's like a mystical, internal, gendered essence, if you take issue with that, which I think most people, like if you look like if you did a survey on the ground, you would find most people don't think that there's a sort of mystical, internal, gendered essence, which is a sort of basic thing to believe. That's considered an extremist view. That's recast as an extremist view. And people who question this, who question the effects that we've just heard, are called anti-gender. Anti-gender. Now, when most people hear the word gender, they don't think of 65 different genders, some of which, are in between. They think of women. Because for a very long time, gender acted as a shorthand for policies related to women's rights. If you go back through EU policy over decades, you will see when we talk about gender mainstreaming, it was about men and women. And implicitly, it was about women, because we were worried about equality between men and women because women were unequal. So when people hear gender, they hear women. And so when you say someone is anti-woman, then people go, oh, you're one of these backward misogynists, aren't you? So it's a very clever kind of trick, and it uses women as a rhetorical shield. I'm not doing anything, put away your weapons, or you can take them out, but I've got a woman in front of me kind of thing. So anti-gender is a way of using women as a rhetorical shield. Another one is, if you look at the LGBTQI Equality Strategy, they talk about, for instance, conversion practices. And this is a rhetorical way of alluding to the barbaric past of, you might think of America and like anti-gay camps and this sort of thing. And so you're this sort of, it's all of these ideas of conversion are bundled together. And we have this idea that we should ban conversion practices. And this is using lesbians and gays now as a rhetorical shield, because most people think that people are born this way. Most people, we've had a long period of acceptance for lesbians and gays. And most people are sort of like, conversion practices, isn't that weird thing that Americans do in the Bible Belt or something like that? And then you kind of slip in for gender, for trans people, conversion practices for trans people. And then the document says 47 to 48%, the strategy says 47 to 48% of trans men and women have experienced conversion practices at some point. wow, you think they've been sent to camps or something, right? Maybe, no, it's anything that might counsel them that perhaps there's another reason why they are feeling bad, which isn't that they may need to have surgeries or go on hormone treatments or do something that is not possible, which is change their sex. That you will solve all these problems if you can approximate the opposite sex. And if you say, well, that might be something else going on here, this is often seen as conversion practices. Things like parents not being completely and totally affirming. These are conversion practices. So what happens if you are a professional, or a psychologist or something like that, and you are trying to do your job, which is to try to get to the root of what a person might be experiencing, and you have this ban, which is being pushed forward by these NGOs and these activists, that says you mustn't engage in conversion practices. You simply must affirm. And then you have all these people that are produced as collateral damage of that. People like Kira Bell in the United Kingdom, who talked about how she was actually astonished by how quickly she was pushed through this affirmative process to have irreparable changes done to her body. And she trusted these professionals. She said, well, I'm trans if you say I'm trans, right? And these are professionals. And they said, well, you're trans if you say you're trans. And so nobody was taking responsibility for this situation until this poor woman is left with irreparable changes to her body. And this is not there's a growing movement of detransitioners who talk about the fact that this lack of gatekeeping, which is something that that activists have been trying to get rid of. No gatekeeping, you simply are, you're trans if you say you're trans. This had profound and terrible impacts on their bodies, on their lives, that they now have to live with. And people say, oh, it's a small number of detransitioners. It's a small number. It's like, you have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. You know, that they don't mind the collateral damage of that. And so there's this idea of like conversion practices is again this rhetorical cover, this shield that uses lesbians and gays to hide what might actually be quite reasonable things, that you might want to have a discussion with a young woman about what is causing the hatred of her body. And it's awful when I think about it. Like anyone who's, this story that you told of the woman growing up, I've got daughters and so on, and just the thought that they're going to hate I know they're going to hate their bodies. I know it. And someone's going to offer them an out. It's something you have to live with your whole life, trying to come to terms with this body that you have. And it's like, this becomes something actually that you should change. That it would fix your problems if actually you did change. It's a cliche, but you'd never say that to an anorexic. You would never say that. You would understand that this is part of something that you have to come to terms with, living in your body. But when it comes to trans people, so-called trans people, this is conversion therapy, conversion practices. So when you're looking at these kinds of this rhetoric and so on, it all sounds so kind. It all sounds, just be nice. And it's about anti-discrimination. You're reading it, and well, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds okay. I mean, I like women's rights. I don't have a problem with gay people. And what's hidden underneath that is what's actually happening, which is that a lot of this stuff is used simply as a rhetorical cover. Okay, so I have limited time, and I'm only on my second point. Sex becomes, the second point I want to make is that gradually gender is displacing sex as the primary category. Again, through a rhetorical cover around demedicalization and bodily autonomy, we have what is actually a profound change in what it means to be a man or a woman. So there's within the equality strategy, it says some countries still have requirements, medical requirements, in order to change in order to transition. And that sound, again, is harking back to, oh, wow, you're going to mutilate people. This is like, the medical sterilizing, you have to sterilize trans people. That sounds awful. Except that what's actually being talked about are surgeries, some of which have a sterilizing effect, that are actually demanded as life-saving, gender-affirming care in another context. But in this context, when you want to change sex legally, this is medicalization. these exact same surgeries that are demanded become an imposition of medicalization. So if you get rid of that requirement, you don't have to change anything. Gender is just an essence, it's a feeling, it's an ephemeral kind of thing. I feel it, therefore I am it, right? And one wonders why, generations of women who suffered so much from inequality and oppression and rape and so on, just felt like identifying as women. Don't you think it would be easier if they just didn't do that? I don't know why they didn't do that. Couldn't they just be like, I kind of feel like a man, so you're not gonna rape me, right? No, of course not, right? So it becomes this, if legal sex is self-identity, then sex becomes an unverifiable feeling. If sex is unverifiable, sex-based protections can't be enforced. If sex can't be enforced, then women's refuges, sports, prisons, all collapse into mixed sex. Data on sex becomes completely meaningless. I mentioned I'm a sociologist. One of the most, if not the most important variable is sex. Now, can we trust some of that data? I read a BBC article recently that said there's been an increase in sex crimes by women. Oh, that's interesting. And then and because the numbers are so small, right? If you have an increase, that's going to be a big increase. And it said in the article, why do we have this stereotype about women as being less sexual than men? As being, and I do believe someone did this a few years ago. Someone at the BBC knew what was up because in illustrating the article was a picture clearly of a man with lipstick on. So they were telling us something. There's something wrong with these stats. But how are you supposed to know that? As a sociologist, I don't know. I have no idea how good this data is that I'm supposed to be using. If sex is replaced with gender, then your sex, the boundaries that you have to have as a girl, as a woman, because of your sex, and also because of the stereotypes that are used against you as a result of your sex, which is that you're supposed to be kind, you're supposed to be accommodating, and so on. You're not really supposed to have boundaries. Well, you can't. There's just nothing there. So, for example, 8 nurses raised concerns in Darlington NHS Foundation Trust over the use of changing rooms by a man who considered himself a woman. And it was his desires that were put forward. And as women, they were supposed to say, oh, you think of yourself as a woman today. That's so nice. Good for you. I'm going to go into that little cubicle there and possibly fall into a toilet while I get dressed. Or I'll be real nice and I'll get dressed get undressed in front of you. You know what? What am I supposed to say to my daughters when I'm trying to teach them boundaries, that men are going to use your niceness against you and your kindness and your accommodating nature against you, and you stick up for yourself and you say, no, I have a boundary. I will not get naked. I will not do anything. I will not do anything you want me to do unless I want to. No. If it comes to this particular situation, which a man comes into a change room, now I have to say, oh, but your boundaries don't matter in that case. And in fact, if you assert your boundary, you will be disciplined, which is exactly what happened to those nurses. That transgender woman, man, lodged a complaint against them. They were disciplined for refusing to change in front of him. Can you imagine that? So boundaries are meaningless. Okay, I will just collapse the third point very quickly. But I do think it's extremely important. A huge part of this is the policing of dissent. Criminalizing particularly women who speak out, and emboldening, I think, misogynists. The strategy talks about the need to harmonize hate speech legislation, which means that when activists are successful in one country in getting hate speech legislation passed, anything from inciting violence, which most people agree shouldn't exist, to inciting hatred, to insulting language, being criminalized, and we're supposed to harmonize this, what activist-led version of hate speech are we going to get? And the issue with that is that we have already seen in Canada, we've seen it in Australia, we've seen it in the United Kingdom, activists will weaponize the police against dissenting women. You've had the police at your door. and will often use very, very expansive forms of hate speech, understandings of hate speech in order to chill dissent, to drag women through legal processes to punish them for speaking out, for misgendering a man, for saying what they see is real in front of them. That is a disciplinary act. It disciplines women for speaking out. It is, and it's like we all have this imperative to be kind, be nice, use nice words. We all know it's not true that this man is a woman, but just be nice, just say it. Well, yeah, just say it on pain of legal process, on pain of losing your job, on pain of having the police at your door. So disagreement is pathologized as hate. Women defending their sex-based rights become suspected extremists. And activists and bureaucracies push for speech policing, social media monitoring via algorithms and AI and so on to detect so-called hate speech, which often is a very expansive definition, and then the outright criminalization of insulting language that people do not like to hear. Meanwhile, self-identifying males gain protected status, and misogyny is often shielded. And just to give you an example of this, Graham Linehan recently, you probably heard the story, he makes a joke about, well, if men invade your spaces, women, just punch them in the bleep. And he makes this joke about this. 5 police officers show up at Heathrow to arrest him when he gets off a plane. But I've been to protests, you've probably been to protests, where there are placards that say, punch a turf. Literally the exact same statement. So he said, punch this person in the in the genital area, and punch a turf, okay? Police arrest Graham Linehan, police take pictures with the protesters. Decapitate a turf. Guillotines. That's fine. We're supposed to be tackling hate. That hate is okay. Calling people Nazis who disagree with you, that's fine. Is that not extreme? Is that not extremism? That's totally mad. So we are shielding these people. These become like an extension. These activists become like an extension of the disciplinary state. Whereas women who speak up, and it's very often women, Graham and Linehan being the exception, very often women get sacrificed on the altar of this ideology. Thank you.